Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. So happy to see all your faces. I'm so pleased to tell you about David Bocarsly, who has joined us. He is the Executive Director of the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California, and he brings years of experience in legislative advocacy and policy work, having championed Jewish community interests at the state capitol. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from USC with a certificate in social justice. And tonight he's going to guide us through the many propositions that are on our ballot, and his insights today will definitely help us understand the potential impact of these propositions on our communities and broader public. So thank you for being here, and take it away. I also will ask that we're going to have all questions in the chat, and David will answer as much as he can. So we're going to keep it moving. And again, the recording will be at the website, on the website, ourki.org. You can look for podcasts.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you too to Rebecca and Rabbi Sher for inviting me. I always really enjoyed doing this and being part of your really warm and wonderful community. So as Amy mentioned, I've spent most of my career working in and around the state government. I come to this work from when I was at UCLA. I about 12 years ago now was elected student body president at UCLA. I was the first person to do so while wearing a kippah, and really developed my passion for state government when I realized how important and impactful the state government was to basically so many facets of our life, including at that moment higher education. And I've since spent a lot of my career at the intersection of Judaism and politics. I worked for Congressman Jerry Nadler in New York, who represents the most Jewish congressional district in America, doing his Jewish and Israel work. And then when I came back to California, I worked for a number of state senators in the legislature, all of them Jewish, representing large Jewish districts, including Senator Ben Allen, who I know represents Kehillat Israel, and is a member of KI. And I worked for him for a number of years. He became chair of the Legislative Jewish Caucus, which is a group of now 19 Jewish elected officials in the state legislature, and brought me on to basically run the caucus for a number of years. When he finished his term as chair of the caucus, I stayed on and worked for Senator Scott Wiener and ran the caucus. And for the last 2.5 years, I have been the executive director of JPAC, the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California, which is a coalition of all the major Jewish organizations across California that lobbies the state government on behalf of the Jewish community's broadly shared issues and values. So I spent a number of years working in the Capitol. Now I lobby members of the Capitol, and it's really fun for me to do this type of forum because I'm able to kind of bring together a lot of my various experience and try to deconstruct the ballot so that it can be a little easier for you, because there's so much on the ballot that isn't the presidential and that isn't the U.S. Senate that really impacts our lives. And it's, I think, really great. I'm always impressed that you always get such a great turnout. It means that all of you are really interested in trying to understand the ballot from top to bottom. And I get really excited to be able to share why this is so important and how you can really understand it. So I'll plan to spend a good amount of time. I'll start. Well, what I'll do is I'll start by giving you kind of an overview of what to expect on the ballot, and then I'll spend most of our time talking about some of the state propositions. And then for those interested at the end, I can also stay on and talk about some of the local and county ballot measures that might be interesting to all of you. So with that, I'm going to jump in. And as Amy mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will do my best to try to read your questions in real time and incorporate some answers into my presentation. But if I don't get to them, I'll try to get to some more at the end as well. So thank you for being here. So to start off, I first want to do a really important plug. I think this probably isn't the case for most of you because you chose to come to this tonight. But if you haven't yet registered to vote, I really want to make the plug that you should and can do so online or in person by October 21st. a week from today. You can also go, if you miss the online voting registration, we in California have a really accessible voting opportunity. You can go to any vote center in the entire county in the 10 days leading up to the election or on election day and register to vote on the spot and vote. If you have registered, you should hopefully have received your ballot in the mail. And you're welcome to have it open while I talk and we can go through it, or you can take notes around it or whatever works best for you. Don't write on the ballot except for your answers, but it might be nice to have that in front of you. You can also go to, actually a Senator Ben Allen bill a number of years ago opened up the access to voting in LA County. You don't have to go to your local polling place anymore. You can go to any voting center in all of LA County, and you can do so to most of them for up to 10 days leading up to November 5th. I can tell you, I always like to vote the weekend before the election or the weekend before the election. The lines are way shorter than they will be on election day, and it's really nice to do that if you aren't sending in your ballot by mail. So some housekeeping, I think it's really important to share that. So even if you already know some of this stuff, you can share with your friends and make sure that everyone else has access to voting. So before we jump into the propositions, I do want to give you a high-level overview of what's on your ballot. As you may know, California has what's called a top two voting system. And that means that there isn't a Democratic and Republican primary for any of the races, with one exception, of course, and that's the President of the United States. It's the only time you'll be voting in a primary, which we did in March, for either a Democrat or Republican or another party. Everyone else, for all of the other races, all the candidates are on the same primary ballot, no matter what their party affiliation is. And the top two vote getters face off in the general election. So you may see races on your ballot. Now that we are in the general election, you may see races on your ballot with two Democrats or two Republicans because those people earn the most votes in the primary. Now, for the local races, that's LA City, LAUSD, LA County, or any other small city that you might live in. If one candidate secures more than 50% of the votes in the primary, they will win outright. So some candidates have already won office for next year in the March ballot, and you might not see those races on your ballot anymore. However, for state and federal races, it's required to have a general election. So even if there's only one candidate on the ballot, or if one candidate earned 95% of the votes in the primary, they still must be elected with a majority of votes in the general election. So for state and federal, that means state legislatures and U.S. Congress. If you have a race in your district, you should expect to see one or two candidates on your ballot. And at the local level, you may or may not have a race that you might see. So that's kind of why some races are on your ballot and why not. Let's talk about the races for elected office you might see on your ballot, and then we'll spend most of our time talking about the ballot measures. So in addition to the presidential election, there are a ton of races that may be that have less information available. The second most prominent race on the ballot is for U.S. Senate, and that's between Congressman Adam Schiff and baseball great Steve Garvey. With our top two system, this race could have featured two Democrats, but there were enough prominent Democrats running in the primary that they split the vote, and Garvey, a Republican, made it into the general. You get to vote for this race twice. Once to fill the remainder of Senator Feinstein's seat. Really, that means up until January when they swear in the new Congress. And then you get to vote again for the full upcoming 6-year term. So that's why you might see that race twice on your ballot. Once is for literally a couple of weeks, and then once is for the full term. I assume you know most of you have enough information to make an informed decision there. But if you have any questions about that race, I'm happy to also answer them at the end. The next level that you'll find in your ballot is the state legislature. And that's the level of government that I lobby. And of course, I can talk for days. I won't, but I can, about how powerful the legislature is and how critical these races are. Yeah, I'm not going to do that, so we can get to the crux of this. But I will say the legislature has 80 assembly members and 40 state senators. Assembly members serve 2-year terms, so all of them are up for re-election, and you will definitely have an assembly race on your ballot. Senators, these are California or state senators, which are not to be confused with the U.S. Senate that Schiff and Garvey are running for. They serve 4-year staggered terms, meaning that only half of them are up for re-election each cycle. So depending on where you live, you may or may not see a state Senate race on your ballot. The governor and other statewide elected officials are in the middle of their 4-year terms, so you won't see any of those races on this ballot, but you will in 2026. So we got federal, we have state, and then there are the local races. LA County has a countywide district attorney, and that's a really interesting race between Nathan Hochman and the incumbent George Gascon that will be on your ballot if you live in LA County. The county also has 5 supervisors that serve 4-year staggered terms. As I mentioned, you can win outright in the primary if you receive over 50% of the vote. And it just so happens that all 3 supervisor races that were on the ballot this year had an incumbent running they were all pretty popular, and all 3 of the incumbents secured majorities in March. So you won't see a supervisor race on your ballot no matter where you live in LA County. But we will be revisiting this conversation around supervisors a little later when we get to LA County Measure G. That's going to be relevant later. Getting more local, you then have races for LA City Council or any other city council that you live in if you don't live in the city of LA, and school board and community college district. And you may or may not see them on your ballot because, again, all of those have staggered terms. So some of them are up for election now and some of them are not. Finally, the last of the elected officials are Superior Court judges. I want to spend a minute mentioning them because I know that it's a pretty obtuse election every single time. And I'll just say this. There are over 400 Superior Court judges that oversee trials across all of LA County. Their trials, these are people who cover trials for anything that has to do with state and local laws like murder and theft, also child custody, divorces, contract disputes, and small claims. And these judges make rulings and hand down penalties for all these types of cases. They serve 6-year terms, but they only appear on the ballot if someone challenges them when they're up for re-election. So of the 400 of them, only a third of them would be up for re-election this cycle. And of those, only 9 races had a competitive primary. So in March, you saw 9 of those races on the ballot. And as I mentioned, if you get 50% of the vote in the primary, you won't be on the general. So now there are 5 that remain on the general ballot. So of the 400 Superior Court judges in LA County, you're going to see 5 of them on your ballot. And they're important, but it's really kind of hard to find information about them. There's just not that much money and not that much attention or awareness put into these races. So it's really hard to figure out who to vote for. What I will say without getting into detail is I always recommend looking up any judge candidate's rating from the LA County Bar Association. I also look at media outlets like the LA Times. If there's a political party that you know and trust, you can look up their endorsements. And you can also look at the candidates' websites and figure out who and which groups have endorsed each of them, so you could figure out kind of what their value sets are and figure out what you most are aligned with. So I'm not going to get into the details about the judges, but I wanted to spend that second so you have a basis to try to figure out how to cast those votes. And then, of course, what we're going to spend our time today talking about is there are the ballot measures. Ballot measures can be at the state or the local level in California. Not all states allow ballot measures, but California does. They essentially serve one of 2 purposes. Either the legislature voted to put something on the ballot because it is required to get a vote of the people to change the Constitution or pass a bond, or 2, interest groups gathered signatures to get something on the ballot because they could not get that policy passed through the legislature. Or they want to overturn something the legislature or a previous ballot measure did, right? So either the legislature put something on the ballot because they needed to, or the community put something on the ballot because the legislature wasn't going to do what they wanted. This year, we have 10 state propositions on the November ballot. 5 of them fall into category 1, put on the ballot by the legislature. And they're the ones in the single digits, props 2 through 6. And of that, the even greater granular breakdown is 2 of those are bond measures and 3 of them are constitutional amendments, which is why they had to be on the ballot. The other 5 were put on the ballot by the public via a petition. They had to get a certain number of signatures to get it on the ballot. And they are the ones that are in the 30s, props 32 through 36. So it's pretty straightforward. You got props 2 through 6, props 32 through 36. And that's how it's broken down. There are also 2 or 3 ballot measures from the county, depending on where you live. 6 from LA City, if you live in LA City, and 1 for LAUSD School Board, if you live in an LAUSD district. It's a lot. We're going to go through the state ones in most detail, the 10 of them. And then if you're interested in staying on, I'll try to breeze through the local measures at the end. So with that, I'm going to jump into Proposition 2. I'm seeing one question in the chat. I think I answered it as I kept going, but if there's anything else, feel free to keep writing into the chat. Okay, so if you have your ballots, feel free to turn to Proposition 2. What this does is it is a bond that would borrow $10 billion to build schools and community colleges. California's school buildings are increasingly run down and lack basic functionality like air conditioning in many places. Upwards of a third of schools don't actually meet the state's minimum safety standards right now. Unlike in many other states, California doesn't pay for school repairs through permanent funding streams. So they have to keep coming back to the voters asking for funding when they need to do repairs and renovations. In 2020, 2 cycles ago, you may remember there was a similar $15 billion bond measure for this purpose that actually failed. And that only exacerbated the problem in our schools. So what would Prop 2 do? It would provide $8.5 billion to K-12 schools and $1.5 billion to community colleges to renovate, fix, and construct their school facilities. The money would not just be paid for by the state, it would be distributed through matching grants, and the state would be paying a greater share of the costs for less affluent districts and those with higher numbers of English learners and foster youth. So it's important for also localities to be able to help match, to be able to secure some of that money. A small sum of that money would be set aside for removing lead from water, creating transitional kindergarten classrooms, and building career and technical educational facilities. So that's basically what it does. But I want to spend also 1 second answering the question that many of you might have, which is, what is a bond? Many of you might know what a bond is from a consumer standpoint. You go and you buy a government-backed bond that basically says, I'm guaranteed to get this money back over time and with interest, with a set amount of interest. Really what we do when we're voting on bonds, when we approve a bond measure, we're essentially giving the state, in this case it's the state, permission to borrow money now that it will pay back over time with interest. So it's the other side of us buying a bond. Essentially, when we buy a bond, we're paying the government now. We're giving the government money now that they will pay us back over time with interest, of course. So when we vote for these bond measures, we're basically allowing the government to sell more bonds and use the revenue to support the issue on the ballot. Of course, they'll have to generate the money in the future to pay back not only the principal, but also interest. And they do so by either reallocating other expenses in the budget or through increased revenue, which might include increased taxes. So right now it's borrowing, and in the future it means that the revenue needs to come in. So that's essentially what a bond is, and I'm mentioning that in this one, but it'll be relevant for a couple of other ones as well. So anyways, Proposition 2, to refresh, a yes vote on Prop 2 is saying we're basically the board of the state. We allow you to borrow $10 billion to fund school construction and modernization projects. A no vote is maintain the status quo, no new funding for schools. To Dr. Siegel's question, I'm not sure why it was defeated. New spending is oftentimes opposed by certain interest groups, and it has consequences. And I'll mention in a second what the supporters and the opponents of this are, so you can kind of get an understanding. But really, oftentimes the product of the time, a product of how much money is spent on races, and a sense of whether it is a priority amongst all the other things on the ballot. The supporters of this measure, Prop 2, it's led by State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. He's basically our state schools chief that's elected statewide. A lot of the powerful school groups are really involved in support of this measure. The Association of California School Administrators, the California School Boards Association, the California Federation of Teachers, and the Small School Districts Association. They've all come together in support of this. And you also find, interestingly, often opposing groups that find themselves at opposite ends of certain issues in support of this. You've got the state Democratic and state Republican parties in support of this measure. You've got the Labor Federation and the Chamber of Commerce, which represents business interests, both supporting this. And then from a media standpoint, you got the LA Times, SF Chronicle, and Sacramento Bee all endorsing this measure. The supporters have raised about $6.6 million in favor of this, and they say it's really critical for making basic safety improvements in schools. And the opponents have actually raised no money. The main group in opposition is the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and you'll see them on a lot of these measures, mostly in opposition. They're the Taxpayer Association that largely opposes any new taxes or any new government spending. And so they're naturally opposed to bonds because that would require increased spending in the future, or increased spending now and increased revenue generation in the future. A couple of other media outlets are opposing this. The Mercury News, SoCal News Group, and the San Diego Union Tribune are notable ones. So there's a strong supporting coalition, a non-active opponent coalition, and polling on this, as of the most recent polling that I could find, which was by the Public Policy Institute of California, it was conducted a couple of weeks ago, has about 54% of people said that they were in favor, and 44% have said that they were against. And what you'll find with polling is you need a pretty sizable lead about a month or two out, because polling will oftentimes, the supporters will oftentimes decrease as you get closer and closer to the ballot. So 54% is demonstrates that it was leaning yes, but it's going to be a pretty close ballot measure, in my opinion. I see, Mark, you mentioned that it costs the state $500 million each year. So that goes back to the bond piece, right? We're borrowing $10 billion up front to make expenses now, and then over the course of 30 years, we have to pay back. So we'll pay back over time more than the $10 billion that we're spending now because we're paying it back with interest. Okay. That is Proposition 2. I'm going to move on, unless I see more questions come in the chat. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to skip Prop 3 for a second and go to Prop 4, since Prop 2 and Prop 4 are pretty similar. They're both bonds. So Proposition 4 is also a $10 billion bond to respond to climate change. Same idea, same amount of money. Relatively coincidence that's the same amount of money, but it's there. You can kind of compare those two, and which is, I think, really helpful. And the context here is this. The state approved a $54.3 billion spending package in 2022, specifically around what they call the California Climate Commitment. So the state basically, we're going to spend all this money on all these major climate-related projects, but that year the state was in a major budget surplus, and for various reasons, the state went into a very big budget deficit in 2023. So the state the legislature and the governor had to make some significant cuts, and they rolled back about $10 billion of this $54 billion in funding for climate projects. Just because the state is in a budget shortfall doesn't mean that the climate crisis and its impacts aren't relenting. So the legislature decided to come to the voters and ask to make up that $10 billion delta by borrowing funds. So they don't have the funds available now, so a bond was a solution. And the bill that put this, so the legislature passed a bill and had to be signed by the governor to put on the ballot. The bill was actually authored and championed by Senator Allen, as I mentioned, my former boss and KI member, and he has been a leading environmental advocate in the legislature. So what would this do? Of the $10 billion, about $3.8 billion would be spent on water projects. Half of that would go to improve drinking water quality, and the remainder on protecting the state from floods and droughts. The rest of the money, beyond the 3.8, would be spent on various projects, including wildfire and extreme heat projects, on nearly $2 billion on that. Natural lands, parks, and wildlife projects, nearly $2 billion on that. Coastal lands, bays, and ocean protection, about $1.2 billion. And clean energy projects, a little less than $1 billion. And then a couple of other smaller things. So the big thing is removing lead from water, making sure water is safe to drink, but also there's a lot of stuff around wildfire, extreme heat, and natural parks. So a yes on Proposition 4 allows the state to borrow $10 billion for various climate and fire prevention, climate-related issues, including fire prevention, energy conservation, and agriculture projects. And a no maintains the status quo. No new funding for climate change. The state has to deal with what they have already made it allocated, the 40-something billion dollars. The supporters are naturally led by climate-related groups. There's the Clean Water Action, Natural Wildlife Federation. You've also got impacted entities that are supporting this measure, like the California Professional Firefighters Association, the Municipal Utilities Association, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. So groups that are impacted by some of these things. And then you've got a lot of labor groups involved, the California Labor Federation, SEIU, the Teachers Association, interestingly enough, and the League of Women Voters, and the Democratic Party supports this measure. LA Times, SF Chronicle, and SACB have endorsed yes. I am here as an unbiased person trying to share information, and so I don't typically show any sort of bias when I give these presentations, but I do want to mention, for full disclosure, that my organization, JPAC, has also endorsed this measure because we advocated for this bill when it was in the legislature. And there's a lot of Jewish work in the climate space. The supporters have raised about $1 million for this measure. The opponents of this measure are, again, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. The Republican Party opposes this one. They supported the last one. They oppose this one. And there are some Republican state legislators who have been very vocal in opposition and voted against it. A couple of media outlets also oppose this, the Mercury News, SoCal News Group, and San Diego Union Tribune. And yet, like the last bill or the last bond measure, the opposition has not raised any money, and they're not organizing a strong opposition campaign. The polling for this is even stronger than the last one. 65% have said that they will vote for it. 33% have said they will vote against it. And that breaks down along political party line pretty cleanly. 83% of Democrats support this thing. 64% of independents support it, and 35% of Republicans support it. So you can kind of see that variation. Okay. That's Proposition 4. Now I'm going to go back to Prop 3. Prop 3 is about reaffirming marriage equality in the state constitution. The quick backstory here is that in 2008, Californians voted to ban same-sex marriage when they passed Proposition 8. And that put such language in the state constitution. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court voided that law, allowing same-sex marriage to continue in California. This was 2 years before the same high court made marriage equality legal across the country. They had done it prior, specifically about Prop 8 in California. However, even though that the language is no longer actionable in the state constitution, Prop 8 language does remain in the constitution. And this ballot measure, this proposition, removes the language from the constitution once and for all, and it enshrines the right to same-sex marriage into our Constitution. Even though it doesn't change much in practice, proponents say it's really important, both symbolically and because when the Supreme Court removed abortion protections, Justice Clarence Thomas also wrote that the court should revisit same-sex marriage protections. So this would enshrine same-sex marriage protections in California should the Supreme Court ever act on it. It's not dissimilar from a ballot measure we had 2 years ago that enshrined reproductive rights in the California Constitution in case the Supreme Court ever decided to act on it. Another fun note, another former boss of mine and co-chair of the state's Jewish caucus, Scott Wiener, who represents San Francisco, worked with Assemblymember Evan Lowe to author this bill that put this measure on the ballot. They are both former chairs of the LGBTQ caucus, which is where their connection to this all lies. And so a yes vote removes language from the Constitution banning same-sex marriage and enshrines marriage equality into the Constitution. A no vote maintains the status quo. Marriage equality would still be legal in California, but anti-LGBTQ language would remain in the Constitution. Supporters of this, the leading supporter is Equality California, which is the main LGBTQ statewide advocacy organization. You've also got ACLU, Planned Parenthood, League of Women Voters, California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists in support of this. And then you've got interesting bedfellows, like in the first one we talked about, both labor and the Chamber of Commerce support this. Governor Newsom supports it, and the Democratic Party, and basically all of the media outlets across the state. The Times, the Chronicle, SACB, SoCal News Group, Marin Independent Journal, Mercury News all support this. And again, I try not to infuse my bias, but we have endorsed this measure, and a lot of other Jewish organizations are part of a Jews for Marriage Equality campaign. And those are the only two that we're involved in, so I won't say that again. The supporters have raised $3.1 million so far for this. The opponents have not organized. They have raised no money. The two main opponents are the California Family Council and the American Council of Evangelicals. The polling on this looks pretty promising. 68% have said they will vote for it. 31% said they would vote against it. And that, again, falls largely on party lines. Okay, that's 2, 3, and 4. We'll move on to Prop 5. What this does is it makes it easier for local governments to fund affordable housing and infrastructure projects. So as I mentioned near the top, bonds need to be approved by a vote of the people. But while most elections are decided by a simple majority, certain taxes and bonds at the local level require a supermajority, 2/3 of the vote to pass. So this measure isn't a bond, it is a process measure. What it specifically does is it looks at bond measures that a city council puts on the ballot to fund affordable housing and infrastructure projects and reevaluates what threshold it needs to pass at. Proponents feel that the 67% threshold for these projects is too high of a barrier to get bonds passed. So the legislature voted to put this measure on the ballot to lower that threshold to 55%. So it's specifically around affordable housing and infrastructure projects. And infrastructure is a broad term, but it's specifically for those projects. It would lower the threshold of local bonds from 67% to 55%. In 2000, we did have a similar ballot measure that lowered the voting threshold, again, from 67% to 55% for school construction. So school construction bonds are already at that lower threshold. And what this would do is it would also make sure that affordable housing and infrastructure bonds are also lowered to 55%. This bond was put on the ballot by a state bill and initially addressed both bonds and tax hikes, lowering that threshold for both of them. But the legislature ultimately passed a second bill that watered down this ballot measure a bit to give it a better chance at passing, and it now only applies to bonds. So it's specifically bonds, not tax hikes, for affordable housing and infrastructure projects. You might be wondering this, so I'll say it now. Yes, if this measure passes, the new threshold would apply to any local affordable housing bonds that are on this ballot. And we'll actually talk about one a little bit later, but there might be some in cities across the state. So if this passes, it'll also determine whether a bond measure might actually pass or not. So a yes vote on this lowers the threshold to approve local bond measures for affordable housing and infrastructure projects from 2/3 to 55%, and a no vote keeps the local bond measure threshold at 2/3 of voters. Supporters of this are the Democratic Party, the State Building and Construction Trades Council, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, YIMBY, which is a group of pro-housing activists, the Labor, League of Women Voters, United Way, Bay Area, and you've got the LA Times and Sacramento Bee from the media supporting this, and it's got $5 million raised in support of it. And in addition to arguing that we shouldn't let 1/3 of the voters hold new housing and infrastructure projects hostage, the supporters are also making an interesting local control argument. By giving voters more opportunities to fund such projects at the local level, cities would not be as dependent on the state and federal governments for such resources. So there's an interesting point there. The opponents are, and this is the first one of the 4 that we've talked about that has any serious opposition that's raised any money. The California Chamber of Commerce, the business group I mentioned, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the Republican Party, and Catalyst for Local Control is a group that's organizing this as well. And you've got a bunch of media groups like SoCal News Group, Mercury News, San Diego Union Tribune, and the San Francisco Chronicle all opposed. And the supporters I mentioned raised $5 million. The opponents have raised nearly $30 million at this point. So they've got a pretty strong opposition organizing. Let's see, opponents generally don't want a greater chance at increased spending, which is generally what happens with bond measures. And so they think that the threshold of 67% is appropriately high and we shouldn't lower it. And they are specifically, especially the Republican Party, is specifically calling out Democratic leaders for really trying to undo the taxpayer protections in Proposition 13. Many of you know about Proposition 13 from the 70s. That is a measure that has constantly divided California, and people are evoking Proposition 13 for and against this measure. Okay, that is Prop 5. Proposition 6. And this is the last one of the ones that the legislature put on. And this limits forced labor in state prisons. The California Constitution specifically prohibits slavery and forced labor except to, quote, punish crime. And so that's a direct quote from the Constitution. And we were never a slave state. We don't allow forced labor, but if you were doing it to punish crime, we do allow forced labor. So of the 90,000 inmates in state prisons, the system currently employs nearly 40,000 inmates to do construction, yard work, cooking, and firefighting. And most of these employees, these inmates, earn less than 74 cents an hour. The ones that earn the most are firefighters, and they earn something like $10 a day, which of course is far below our $16 per hour minimum wage in the state. Because of the constitutions, prisons can force inmates into these jobs and punish them if they refuse. And this proposition would prohibit the state from punishing inmates with involuntary work assignments and from disciplining those who refuse to work. Instead, state prisons could set up a volunteer work assignment program to take time off sentences in the form of credit, so it would be a carrot rather than a stick. And county or city ordinances, according to this proposition, would also be able to set up a pay scale for inmates in local jails. This was put on the ballot after it was a top recommendation from the Reparations Task Force that the legislature created a few years ago, and the Legislative Black Caucus really worked to champion this and get this on the ballot. And it follows other states across the political divide, which is pretty interesting. Colorado and Alabama, Tennessee, and Vermont have all taken similar actions in recent years. So a yes vote on this prohibits involuntary work assignments in state prisons. A no vote maintains the status quo. Supporters of this are being led by the ACLU, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, the Democratic Party, teachers associations, of course, the Black Caucus, and Labor, and League of Women Voters. And you've got the LA Times, SACB, and the San Francisco Chronicle in support. And they've collectively raised about $1.2 million in support. The supporters argue that this current practice is inhumane and that people are already punished for their crimes by spending years in prison. They argue that this will allow prisons and prisoners to prioritize rehabilitation over work. The opponents, again, the leading opponent is the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, because cheap labor will cost less than not cheap labor. So it would cost the state more to have to pay them an appropriate wage to work. And the California Republican Party opposes this, and you've got the Mercury News, San Diego Union Tribune, and Pasadena Star News in opposition. But like some of the other ones we talked about before, the opponents have not raised any money for this. Interestingly enough, also the opponents also haven't filed an argument against the measure. I don't think if you look at your ballot, I don't think you'll see an opposition argument. But a couple of prominent Republican legislators voted against it. And it reflects their larger opposition to reparations efforts by the state at a time when the budget deficit is a top priority to address. Even though there is not much organized opposition, the last polling we saw on this actually had this polling at 46% for and 50% against, which is not very promising for that measure. Okay, those are the first five. I will move on, and I'll try to go a little quicker because I'm realizing the time, to the latter five. The next one is Proposition 32, and this raises the minimum wage to $18 an hour. Now, we're entering the section of propositions put on the ballot by the community, so these items that could have been passed by the legislature, but they were not interested or able to do so, which is why the community members got signed petitions and got this on the ballot. In 2016, the legislature approved a measure to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour across the state, and then increase with inflation after that. We're now at $16 an hour, and we're going to hit $16.50 on January 1st. Advocates believe that this isn't enough to keep up with the rising cost of living. LA and nearly 40 other cities have passed measures to make their minimum wage even higher than the state. So this proposition would bring the rest of the state closer to parity with the higher minimum wage cities, raising minimum wage to $18 an hour starting January 1 for bigger businesses, and then increase from there based on inflation starting in 2027 when the smaller businesses catch up. The state's minimum wage would otherwise, if we didn't pass this, the state's minimum wage would rise to $16.50 on January 1. So this ballot measure would really represent a $1.50 increase in the minimum wage starting next year. And I should note that the state has already increased minimum wages for certain industries. Fast food workers now make $20 an hour. You may have heard about that. And healthcare workers have minimum wage rising to $25 an hour. So this would address all industries, whereas some industries have been singled out for for other wage raises. So yes, raises the minimum wage a little bit. No, maintains the status quo that we talked about. Supporters, understandably, are led by labor. There's a number of different labor groups: Working Families Party, the Democratic Party, League of Women Voters, and media include LA Times, Chronicle, and Mercury News. And they've raised just about $600,000 for this measure. And I should note that the supporters make a point that studies have found that California's gradual increase to $15 minimum wage had, quote, no significant, this is what they say based on some major studies, no significant effect on job losses or the economy. So they're saying this hasn't had the negative consequences that people are arguing. The opponents are the California Chamber of Commerce, the Restaurants Association, the Grocers Association, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the Republican Party, unsurprisingly, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and in the media, you've got Pasadena and Bakersfield news outlets opposing this. They've raised just over $500K in opposition compared to the $600K in support. And I've seen a couple of different polls for this. One said that it's polling at 50% versus 49% against. Another said that it had 46% yes, 36% no, and 18% undecided. So that is very much up in the air. It'll be a really interesting ballot measure. The next one is Proposition 33. And the next two are related, and they're actually basically an ongoing feud between two parties about rent control. And I'll talk about that in a second. So Proposition 33 specifically allows local governments to impose rent control measures. This is the third time in recent years. We saw this on the ballot in 2018 and 2020, that we've seen such rent control measures on the ballot. It hasn't passed in either of the past 2 years. So let's see what happens this time. The quick background is that in 1995, California enacted a law called Costa-Hawkins that banned all rent control for buildings built after that year. And it froze in place rent control laws that were existing locally. In Los Angeles, that meant rent control is banned for buildings built after 1978. Advocates have been trying to repeal Costa-Hawkins for years so that cities can enact updated rent control laws if they choose, which they say will keep people in their homes and out of homelessness. The key point here is that cities, even if this passes, cities can still choose whether to enact rent control laws or not. There would be no mandate to do so. It removes the ban, right? It provides the ability to do so. The interesting political story here is that each time this proposition has appeared on the ballot, it has been driven and bankrolled by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Now, you might be wondering, why is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation so focused on rent control? Doesn't feel like it's perfectly aligned with their mission. Well, they argue that it does help their patients who need to stay in their homes, but it also is widely known that this is a pet issue for the organization's longtime president, Michael Weinstein. And you'll hear that name a lot with regards to this measure and the next one. The data is compelling here. 55% of renters are rent burdened, and nearly 30% of renters spend over half of their income on rent. So it's easy to see how rent increases can lead to homelessness. But the opponents argue that rent control makes building new housing economically unviable. So it keeps people in their homes now, but it doesn't actually alleviate our housing crisis. And so with those two kind of back and forth, you can get this divide where different people in the housing space, oftentimes who might share similar political ideologies, have different stances that don't fall neatly along party lines. And then, of course, you've got the landlord groups that are opposed for more obvious reasons, and they tend to be pretty well funded. So a yes on this measure repeals Costa-Hawkins, so cities can choose to enact rent control laws if they want to. A no maintains the status quo, and the current law bans rent control for buildings built after 1995 or earlier, depending on the city, and that's what we would maintain. Of course, the supporting organizations include the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which has largely bankrolled this thing, and they've raised the supporters have raised $42 million, and almost all of it has come from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Also, Democratic Party, and a lot of tenant rights groups. ACE, Housing Now, Tenants Together, Consumer Watchdog, Housing is a Human Right, Unite Here, etc. No media has endorsed this one, interestingly enough. So as I mentioned, they've raised $42 million, mostly bankrolled by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. The opponents are the state's Small Business Association, the Rental Housing Association, YIMBY, which wants more housing built, Chamber of Commerce, the Republican Party, some very prominent Democratic legislators, like the former president of the Senate, and some housing advocates, and of course the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And a lot of the media outlets are opposed to this thing. The LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, SACB, SoCal News Group, Mercury, etc., are all opposed. And the opposition has raised $92 million compared to the $42 million in support. So it's got a lot of money funding in opposition. About half to 2/3 of that has been paid for by the apartment association, understandably. Polling for this is pretty iffy, 51% in support, 46% against. I'm seeing, Emily, you said, can you clarify why they are opposed? I'm not sure which group you're referring to. So if you want to write, I'll keep chatting, and then if you want to write that in the chat, I can also answer that question. I will move to Prop 34, which is related, so we're not moving on. Prop 34 is interesting. It requires certain providers to use prescription drug revenue for patients, and not for other pet projects. I mentioned that it was odd that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation plays so heavily in rent control. Well, this measure claims to be about prescription drugs, yet it is being led by the California Apartment Association, which is equally as odd. Well, as I mentioned, these two things are connected. Now that Michael Weinstein is making his third attempt at rent control, some housing interest groups are fed up and put this measure on the ballot to specifically target him. Measure 33, I have a lot of issues with AIDS. Yeah, so this is also related. I'll probably get to some of your question in this. So people have basically put Prop 34 on the ballot in response to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and Michael Weinstein himself. Wealthy people do fund pet projects all the time, and that probably isn't in itself alarming. But what makes Weinstein a particular target is that he bankrolls these measures using AIDS Healthcare Foundation funds, not his personal wealth, which is what I think you're getting at, Emily. In addition to supporting rent control, he's also used AHF funds to oppose new development and increase density, which further upsets housing advocates like EMB and others. So this measure is pretty wonky, but it essentially says that certain healthcare nonprofits who benefit from a law that is designed to help them financially must spend 98% of their revenue on, quote, direct patient care. If they don't do that, they lose their license to operate in the state. So basically we're saying use the revenue that you're getting from the government on direct patient care, not pet projects about lobbying, or you're going to lose your license to operate in California, which would be a major blow to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And then the measure goes on to describe which healthcare nonprofits it would apply to, and it uses very specific and uncommon criteria that only applies to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Like it says, you have to have spent more than $100 million in the last decade on expenses that are not considered direct patient care, and you must operate like multifamily housing with more than 500 high severity health and safety violations. It's a lot of pinpoint things that basically single out one organization. So basically, this ballot measure asks you whether one man, Michael Weinstein, can continue to use his organization's funds to support rent control policies and or oppose housing density policies. So a yes on this basically bans AIDS Healthcare Foundation from funding non-healthcare ballot measures, and a no maintains the status quo and allows his continued use of his organization to fund such measures. So it's an interesting kind of back and forth. The supporters of this are the California Apartment Association, as I mentioned, a couple of assembly members, Democratic assembly members. The Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is in support of this. The Chamber of Commerce and the Republican Party and the SoCal News Group supports this. And they've raised $36 million, mostly from the Apartment Association. The opponents are obviously the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and another group called the Consumer Watchdog. And a lot of media outlets have opposed this, like the LA Times, the Chronicle, the San Diego Union Tribune, and Mercury News. They've raised $7 million, mostly from just the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And the opponents argue that this is a political hit job paid for by a landlord lobby out for revenge. In a democracy, they say campaigns should make their case to the voters, not silence their opponents. It's an interesting kind of hard-hitting response. Even though LA Times opposes the last ballot measure, they oppose this one too because they don't believe this is the way to silence people. And they, I think, even used the phrase that this is a revenge ballot measure, and they don't like revenge ballot measures. So it's an interesting thing. Just because they're at odds with one another does not mean that people need to vote for one and not the other, or vice versa. Polling on this seems to put it in favor at 51% for and 46% against, which is still pretty close, and who knows where that will land. Okay, I will move on to Proposition 35. And this is about making permanent a tax on managed healthcare insurance plans. Yeah, I'm seeing, Becky, you say that LA Times has a long-running battle with Michael Weinstein and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And I'm just reading it out loud. For the Times to oppose 34 is pretty remarkable. I think I agree with you on that they don't support him and they don't support his previous ballot measure, but they also are making a principled stance in saying, we also don't like this type of legislating. So it's interesting. Prop 35. This is a wonky healthcare policy one. We always seem to get at least one of these wonky healthcare policy ballot measures per cycle, and you'll see plenty of critics saying that it's unfair to push such in the weeds policies to the voters. But here's the simplest way I can explain it based on my best understanding, not being a healthcare expert. There is currently a temporary tax on healthcare plans that expires in 2027. And that money is used to fund Medi-Cal and related expenses. Just by way of background, Medi-Cal is the California's version of Medicaid. It's our public insurance program for low-income people and people with disabilities. This proposition would make this temporary tax permanent, and it would limit how the revenue could be spent. Right, so we got this temporary tax that has a little bit more flexibility. It would limit how it would be spent, and it would make this a permanent tax. Basically, Medi-Cal has expanded significantly in recent years. It now includes dental insurance, hearing aids, and doulas, and it also includes undocumented immigrants that can now benefit from it, which wasn't the case a couple of years ago. And as a result of that, nearly 15 million Californians, which is over a third of the state, is on Medi-Cal. So, unsurprisingly, there's been an increased demand for Medi-Cal. And to accommodate that increased demand, Medi-Cal is reimbursing healthcare providers at lower rates. And more doctors are refusing Medi-Cal patients because they won't be paid as well. Right? So there's more Medi-Cal patients, there's more things Medi-Cal is covering, but Medi-Cal doesn't have more money to make up for all of that. So when you go to the doctor and they negotiate with the insurance company, Medi-Cal is saying, I'm only going to pay you this rate. And that's much lower than some of the private insurance companies. So certain doctors are now it's refusing Medi-Cal patients, which makes it harder to get care for those people. So that's why this is put on the ballot. This makes a permanent tax, and it also limits its use to primary and specialty care, emergency services, family planning, mental health, and prescription drugs. Which ensures that healthcare providers are paid more. You can't use this funding from this tax on other things. On the flip side, Governor Newsom had proposed using some of this tax revenue to offset cuts to prisons, parks, roads, and other services to help manage the budget deficit. So this would ensure that the existing funds only go to Medi-Cal and remove the legislature's flexibility to direct it where they think it is most needed. Understandably, basically the entire healthcare industry supports this. You've got the California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood, the Hospital Association, the Dental Association, and you've got the Democratic and Republican parties in support of this. On the flip side, opponents believe that the legislature will extend this tax before the deadline ends in 2027 anyways, but they would have more flexibility if they did it themselves in that scenario to spend the money on the state's greatest needs. They argue that this is not the type of work that voters should be doing, and it's the legislature's job, especially because governing by ballot box makes it much harder to make necessary tweaks down the road. So it's the legislature's job to figure this stuff out. Newsom and other state advocacy groups do oppose this, but they won't really put any money or firepower behind it. They've raised $0. You've got Newsom, the League of Women Voters, a couple of other groups, Courage California, and others that are opposing this, but have not put any money behind it, and they haven't even registered opposition on the ballot. You also do have, interestingly enough, most media outlets opposed to this. You've got the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Diego Union Tribune, Mercury News, and SoCal News Group all opposed to this thing. But again, the supporters all the healthcare industries, both parties, and they've raised $51 million, and the opponents have raised nothing. And polling puts this at a 63% in favor, 34% opposed. So that looks likely to pass. And then the last one is Proposition 36. Increasing penalties for theft and drug trafficking. This is probably the hottest measure on the ballot this cycle. You've probably already started to see the TV ads or the mailers. It's raised some good money too, and people are really invested in this. It's intended to address retail theft, drug abuse, and homelessness at a time when all three of those issues are top of mind for so many of us. So here's the quick backstory. In 2014, voters passed Proposition 47, which softened penalties for low-level theft and drug crimes as a way to reduce prison overcrowding and work towards a more humane carceral system. Since then, prosecutors, police groups, and major retailers have attributed Prop 47 to an increase in these very actions. They put this measure on the ballot. They put a measure on the ballot to roll back parts of Prop 47 4 years ago, and that failed. And they're trying again this year. And there's reason to believe there's a lot more momentum this year than there was 4 years ago. To be clear, Prop 47 didn't actually decriminalize any crimes. It lowered certain crimes like drug possession for personal use to misdemeanors instead of felonies. Such crimes are still punishable by up to a year in jail, but police often don't find it worth their time to prosecute misdemeanors, so we're seeing a lot less prosecution. Even though it still is on the books. This ballot measure would reclassify some of those crimes as felonies once again, which would come with longer prison sentences and create new mandatory sentence enhancements for petty theft. It also reinstates the three strikes law in some ways, which we've done away with in California, by allowing harsher penalties for a third theft or a third drug possession charge. So supporters of this measure say that Prop 47 led to an increase in drug use and retail theft, and they argue that the increase in homelessness is caused by drug dependence, and that enhancing penalties for drug possession is the only way to disincentivize such behavior. Opponents say that harsher punishments don't prevent crimes, and instead point to other factors that led to increased crime, drug use and homelessness, like the pandemic and cost of living increases. They say that increasing penalties is inhumane and disproportionately targets people of color. And they argue that increasing the prison population will redirect funds away from mental health and drug treatment programs that we've been investing in. The politics on this one is interesting. Newsom and Democratic lawmakers largely oppose it, and initially proposed a competing ballot measure to go on the ballot. But they ultimately withdrew that effort and instead passed a series of retail theft and drug possession laws that increase penalties in less harsh ways than this does. And Newsom signed a whole package of them about a month or two ago. And they hoped that signing that package would convince Prop 36 supporters to pull the measure from the ballot, but they didn't. So here we are. So a yes on this rolls back Prop 47 and creates harsher penalties for some theft and drug crimes. A no on this we'll still see, if you vote no on this and this doesn't pass, we'll still see increased penalties when these new laws passed by the legislature take effect next year, but they wouldn't be as encompassing as if this measure passes. The supporters of this are some of the big retail companies, Walmart, Target, Home Depot. You've also got the District Attorneys Association and the Correctional Peace Officers Association. The Republican Party, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and the Chamber of Commerce are all supporting this. The San Diego Union Tribune and the Mercury News are immediate in support, and they've raised $13 million collectively. The opponents are Governor Newsom and a host of prominent Democratic state leaders, the Speaker of the Assembly, the head of the Senate, ACLU, the Democratic Party, the League of Women Voters, and others. And the LA Times, SACB, and SoCal News Group oppose this. And they've raised $5.2 million compared to the $13.2 raised in support. The polling for this looks pretty promising for the supporters. One poll has it at 71% in support, and another poll has it at 60% in support, with 19% undecided. So I think this is really hitting on a deep-seated fear that people have at this moment about increase in drug use and retail theft, and it's looking very likely to pass, despite large swaths of the Democratic Party opposing it. Okay, we're at 8:03, and we've now finished the 10 state ballot measures. That was a lot, and I just talked at you for the better part of an hour. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm not seeing too many more questions in the chat, which is great. And what I want to offer to do is go through in a quicker way the county and city ballot measures. But I want to take a moment to say, if you are not in LA City or in LA County, this is not going to pertain to you. And if you'd like to hop off, feel free to do so and don't feel bad about it. And if you are in LA City and LA County and want to hop off, also don't feel bad about it. So I'll give it about 10 seconds to see if anything else comes in the chat, and so people can leave if they want to, and then I'll move on to LA County. All right. So in LA County, as I mentioned, there are 3 ballot measures put on the ballot, but you likely only have 2 of them. One of them is called Measure E. It's about updating emergency services for some LA County areas. It's basically a small parcel tax that will go to the fire department to help fund the fire department, but it really only applies to small cities that don't have their own fire department or unincorporated areas that are serviced by LA County. If you're in LA City or another city that has their own fire department, this doesn't apply to you and it wouldn't be on your ballot. So that's why there are 2, maybe 3. The 2 that we're going to talk about that will be on everyone's ballot in LA County are Measure A and Measure G. Measure A is a sales tax to fund homelessness programs. In 2017, LA County voters approved Measure H. You may remember this, which was a 1/4-cent sales tax to fund homeless services. And that tax is set to expire in 2027. So what Measure H would do is Measure A would repeal Measure H 2 years before it expires and replace it with a 1/2-cent sales tax. So it's increasing from a 1/4 cent to a 1/2 cent to pay for both housing and homelessness services. The tax would remain in effect indefinitely unless repealed by voters, and it would raise more than $1 billion annually for these services. So how would the funds be used? Well, 60% of the proceeds would go to the county for homeless services. And of that, at least 15% would be allocated to cities based on their annual homelessness count. And a small amount would go to an innovation fund to test new ideas for future larger scale programs. The remaining 40% would largely be dedicated to housing production. The largest chunk of that would go to a newly formed LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency to fund the development of affordable housing. They include in this ballot measure multiple layers of oversight to allay any concerns that the money won't be spent or that it won't be spent efficiently, which is a lot of feedback people made after Measure H several years ago. Those layers of oversight include 2 new oversight bodies created by the County Board of Supervisors that will guide the spending. There's also an executive committee made up of elected officials from cities, and the county will develop a plan and oversee its execution. And then there's the leadership table, which is a diverse group of government officials, service providers, business executives, faith leaders, and academics that will advise the executive committee. So these 3 different layers that will help make sure that the money is used efficiently and effectively. Because Measure A qualified for the ballot by citizens, it wasn't actually put on the ballot by the Board of Supervisors. It was put on by the citizens. It is exempt from the 2/3 majority required for government initiative taxes and only needs a simple majority for passage. That's a little bit of a wonky piece I find interesting. They've raised about $6 million in support so far, and leading donors are the California Community Foundation, United Way of Greater LA. Labor and trade unions have donated collectively about $2 million. Organizations that provide homelessness services have donated about a little over $1.5 million. And then you've got some real estate and investment interests that have donated about $65,000. There's no organized opposition, but the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association opposes the measure, contending it is a special purpose tax put on the ballot by groups that will benefit from it. So that is Measure A. And Measure G is about expanding the LA County Board of Supervisors and electing a county executive and a number of other issues. This one is huge, if I may say so. It would completely restructure the LA County Board of Supervisors, which hasn't really been restructured in about a century. The Board of Supervisors is incredibly powerful, and you may not know about them. There are 5 people elected to the Board of Supervisors. Right now, they're all women, which is pretty amazing and historic. But they're 5 people that oversee 10 million constituents, meaning that each of them has a district of 2 million people each. That's more than like 8 governors have in their states. And this is a body of people that is largely unscrutinized because there's very little attention paid towards them. They have a lot of say over what's happening in our county, how services are administered, and they appoint the CEO, unelected, they're appointed, and that CEO oversees daily operations for the county and leads the development of basically the $46 billion annual budget. So it's a pretty important position. So this measure would do a few major things. First, it would expand the board from 5 to 9. So each supervisor would now represent about 1.1 million people rather than 2 million people. It would make the CEO an elected position who would act more like a mayor and able to veto board policies and have full responsibility for department heads. It would establish a legislative analyst to review proposed policies. We have that at the state level. And it would create an independent ethics commission to root out corruption in county government. Those are kind of the major things it would do. And also do a number of smaller things, like make sure that any elected official charged with a felony related to their job would be suspended without pay. It would require department heads to present their annual budget at open hearings. And it would ensure former county officials cannot lobby the county for at least 2 years after leaving. It also prohibits the county from raising taxes to make these changes, if anyone was worried about that. So there's a lot of kind of good governance stuff in here. And the implementation happened over many years. The Ethics Commission would be created in 26. The county executive would be elected by 28. And the expanded board would be elected by 2032 after the 2030 redistricting process. The county has tried to expand the Board of Supervisors unsuccessfully, of course, 8 times over the last century, most recently in 2000. And for context, a century ago, LA County had 500,000 residents. Now we're at 10 million, and the representation remains the same. So the 5 people used to represent 100,000 people each. Now they represent 2 million people each. That's why there is this push to have greater an expanded board and smaller districts, so they can have greater representation. People think that this will also lead to more diversity on the Board of Supervisors. This was put on the ballot by a vote of 3 of the supervisors. 3 of the 5 supported it. Supervisor Lindsay Horvath, led the efforts. Solis and Hahn supported it, and you had Mitchell and Barger, if you know these folks, opposing it. So that is G. So that's the county. I am not seeing any questions in the chat about that, which is great. So I may quickly move over to LA City. I know not all of you live in LA City, so again, this is your invitation to feel free to say goodbye if this doesn't apply to you. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 measures in LA City, but they're pretty straightforward, so I'm going to go through them quickly. And then at the end, there's one for LAUSD that I will mention, which has most of the overlap with LA City, but there's a slightly different district. So you may see that on your ballot, even if you're not in LA City. So the 6 measures for LA City, the first 2 are about, and thank you to all of those who are saying goodbye. The first 2 are about independent redistricting. A lot of agencies, including our state bodies, governing bodies, including the state of California, have moved towards independent redistricting. So they're taking the power out of the elected officials from choosing districts after the 10-year census count, and putting it in an independent body that is supposed to be more equitable and less, you could say, corrupt, or serving the interests of the elected official to try and get reelected. And that's what Charter Amendment DD and Charter Amendment LL will do. DD creates an independent redistricting commission so that the city can't draw their own lines and, in effect, choose their own voters to boost their reelection chances. There was a whole drama when they did redistricting a couple of years ago after the 2020 census, where one of the city council members, Nithya Raman, was essentially drawn out of her district entirely. I think she only had 20% of the people who voted for her the first time in her new district. And that was a decision made by kind of a majority or a plurality of the other city council members. And so this is in part a response to that, and it would make it independent and theoretically more fair. The Charter Amendment LL is for LAUSD constituents, and it would do the same thing for LAUSD Board of Education districts. So it would take the power away from the 7 board members and put it in the hands of an independent redistricting commission. So those are the first 2. The second, the third one I'm going to mention is Charter Amendment ER, and this is about an ethics commission. There has been a lot of corruption and scandal in City Council if you've been following at all. There are a lot of recent City Council members that are currently or recently in prison for corruption. There was the big leaked tape scandal, and so there's been a major push for ethics reform. This works at addressing the alarming amount of corruption and convictions of sitting council members. It would strengthen the ethics commission by giving it a guaranteed budget with a minimum floor that's much higher than it currently is. It would increase penalties for violations of the ethics code from $5,000 to $15,000 per violation, and it would make it harder for elected officials to kill ethics reforms. Now, I'll just say pretty bluntly, this is pretty widely supported. The critique of this is that it actually doesn't go far enough, and there were some council members and activists that actually worked to water this down. People think that at the interest of those council members, but I think this is universally. I haven't seen specific polling, but everything I've seen seems to suggest that this is just good governance stuff. And the question is, could they do more? Okay, Charter Amendment FF is next, and this is about peace officer pensions. What it does is it transfers the pensions for certain peace officers, not police, but all other officers like park rangers and officers at the port and LAX. It transfers their pensions from the LA City Employees Retirement System, it's called LACERS, which houses their pensions now, to the pension plan that for fire and police. So some of them are on the LACERS, the public city employment system, and fire and police have a better pension plan. They want to move those folks over to that pension plan. It would definitely give them better benefits, but it would cost the city over $100 million. And it would also hurt people left in the LACER system, other city employees, by making it a weaker system. LA Times is calling it a, quote, pension giveaway. That one is probably, of all of the 6 at the local level, maybe the most controversial one. The other ones, I think, are largely going to pass. This one has some strong opposition and support. I'll stop there. Sorry, just in the question, are you on DD? The DD was the first one I did. That was about independent redistricting for the city. So forgive me if I missed that. We've now done DD and LL. We've done ER, and we just did FF, which is about pensions. And the last 2 are HH and II. These are about tweaking the city charter, basically the city constitution. The first one, HH, is a hodgepodge of changes, of bigger changes to the city charter, and II is a hodgepodge of small changes to the city charter to improve operations. So HH includes things like bigger things like giving the city attorney the power to issue subpoenas in civil cases, giving the city controller access to contractors' records for audits of how city funds are spent, requiring that 2 members of the Harbor Commission live near the Port of Los Angeles, requiring commission appointees to file financial disclosures before they can be confirmed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of different things that are substantial, but largely kind of like, I think I saw one that said it was like getting their tires realigned, right? It's kind of fixing the charter in some ways that need to be fixed, but there isn't really opposition on some of this, on any of these items. Charter II is some even smaller items. It includes clarifying that the departments can sell food and merchandise to raise money for their operations, clarifying that El Pueblo Monument and the zoo are park property, including gender identity and non-discrimination rules for city employees, allowing electronic signatures on certain government documents. So again, kind of like tweaks around the edges to make good governance changes there. And HH has some bigger items, II has some smaller items. That is all 6 of the LA City measures. The last one I'll just mention is LAUSD Measure US. So we've now gone through 10, 3, we've got 19, and this is the 20th measure. So thank you so much for bearing with us. It's a lot. Hopefully you're taking notes. This last one, Measure US, is a $9 billion school construction bond for LAUSD. So remember we talked about before we have a state bond around schools, which needed matching funds, right? So this would help support LAUSD to match the state to be able to secure some of that funding. We also had another ballot measure that would lower the threshold of voting for bonds from 67 to 55%. That was for affordable housing, and I had mentioned that we had already lowered that threshold for schools, right? So this is the application of that previous law that we've done. So this requires a 55% majority of the votes because of that previous law. What it essentially is a $9 billion school construction bond for LAUSD. It would pay for repairs and modernization of buildings, equipment, and technology, not dissimilar from the proposition we talked about, the state proposition we talked about earlier. It would be repaid over time by increases in property taxes at a rate that would average about $25 for every $100,000 of assessed valuation on residential properties. The district estimates that added cost to property owners would be about $111 per year over the life of the bond, based on the current median assessed value of homes. That is what this would do. We've already talked about it. I don't think I need to spend too much more time in it. And that wraps up all of the ballot measures. Are there any questions that I missed or that people have at this point?
That was amazing. Thank you, David. You really talked our ears off and really got through so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for bearing with me as I just talked at you for an hour 20. I know that can be hard, but if I can be helpful, I am available. So please stay in touch.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Thank you, everyone.
And maybe I'll just say one final plug. We'd love to have more people get involved in the work that we're doing at the state level. So feel free to join our mailing list at jpac-cal.org. We've got Sacramento conferences next year, and we've got a lot of action alerts that we put out there to try to further our community's top issues. So I know that you're all politically engaged, and hopefully that you'll find the time and interest in joining some of our work in the future.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Thanks, David. Bye.
Bye.